Since the start of the Israeli war on Gaza exactly 1 year ago, Israel has continued its aggression on the Palestinian-occupied territories. From arbitrary arrests by the occupation forces to settler violence, Israel continues to make the life of Palestinians in the West Bank difficult, while also killing over 41,000 people in Gaza and counting. Settlement building has expanded dramatically in the past year, with more and more Palestinian lands being seized by the Israeli occupation. Escalating violence in the West Bank raises questions about the fate of the territory. Will it turn into another Gaza? Will Israel continue to exploit the world's focused attention on Gaza and now Lebanon to expand settlements and violations of human rights? And what can possibly stop it from ignoring international law? You're watching Q News. I'm Karim Hatem. Welcome to In Depth. The Palestinian News and Information Agency Wafa has reported that the Israeli occupation forces arrested 25 citizens from the West Bank, including children and a woman. A statement by the Palestinian Prisoners Society and the Commission for Detainees Affairs explained that the arrest campaign was accompanied by acts of violence and threats against detainees and their families, as well as the destruction of property in the homes of civilians. Since the onset of the ongoing Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people exactly 1 year ago, the Israeli occupation forces have detained over 11,200 individuals from the West Bank, including Jerusalem. For more analysis, joining us now from Ontario, Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Welcome. Now, according to the UN, there are hundreds that were killed by Israel in the West Bank, with additional fatalities resulting from settler violence. What is your interpretation to the increased aggression towards Palestinians in this region right now?
Well, in terms of the West Bank, that always is going to be the big prize for Israel. We know that arising from the Oslo agreements in 1993, 61% of the West Bank was deemed to be under full Israeli security and military control, and that that is where it's placed its 500,000 settlers and its over 250 settlements in the West Bank. And is increasingly, these settlements are expanding under a government, probably the most right-wing and nationalist government that Israel has known. That these settlements are expanding. There are new settlements that are being recognized, that there's more land being confiscated by the Palestinians, that the 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank are being herded and crowded into narrow and smaller areas of land to be able to live. So it's inevitable that the cork that Israel is trying to put on the top of the volcano is going to blow off at some time. And obviously Palestinians are rising up in the West Bank to express solidarity and support with the Palestinians in Gaza. That we've seen this unprecedented number of Palestinians killed, over 700 in the past year, because of the crackdown by the Israeli government and its very clear ambitions to want to annex all of the West Bank to Israel.
Now, given that there are no Hamas leaders and resistance groups operating in this area, in the West Bank specifically, what justification does Israel provide for its ongoing violent actions in the West Bank, with airstrikes being conducted on the West Bank for probably the first time since the Second Intifada?
Yeah, what we're seeing now is actually in filling up a enormous political vacuum, where the security forces of the Palestinian Authority are there to, in effect, protect Israeli settlers and Israeli military from attacks. But you don't see whenever Israeli forces go into Tulkarm or Nablus or Hebron, we don't see resistance coming from those security forces. You are seeing Palestinians, young Palestinians, taking, if you like, the resistance into their own hands. Weapons can be found, and they are forming armed groups. I don't know how coordinated they are. I don't know how well trained they are, but they certainly have an ambition to want to be able to resist. And they're largely outmatched by a highly trained, well-equipped, well-financed occupation army that is ensuring that there's no armed resistance to its continual march towards full annexation.
But what is the purpose of actually trying to attack refugee camps? We've seen this in Jenin, we've seen it in Tulkarm, we've seen it also in Gaza. So what do you think the purpose of it?
Well, it's in part intimidation, but it's in part in trying to ensure that you're, in the words of Israeli military and intelligence leaders, you're trying to decapitate the snake. What they're trying to argue, Israelis, is that they want calm and they want no resistance. Any resistance at all to the occupation is obviously deemed to be by an enemy entity who's practicing terrorism and therefore must be crushed with the full force of the Israeli army. And it's not uncommon to see that most of the resistance is coming out of the refugee camps. As poor as Gaza and the West Bank are, among the poorest areas are the refugees who live in the 19 camps in the West Bank or the 8 huge camps in Gaza. That's where you see the flood of young men coming to wind up joining Palestinian armed resistance, because they're the ones who feel, if you like, the sharp edge of the Israeli occupation.
Okay, let's talk more about the settlements. Now, we've seen more settlements increasing and spreading in the last year than we've seen perhaps in the previous years, maybe the last 10 years. Now, there has been approval to the largest land seizure in the occupied West Bank in over 3 decades. Do you think Israel was seizing the opportunity that the world is focusing on Gaza, it's focusing on what's happening in Lebanon, to claim more land in the West Bank?
Yes, well, as I said, the West Bank really is the major prize for Israel, not Gaza. What we're seeing is not only the expansion of existing settlements, the creation of new settlements, but if you're going to be building these new settlements or expanding the existing settlements, you need more roads to be able to connect them and to be able to have these settlers go into jobs into across the 48 borders into Israel. But you're also going to want to try to have jobs that are in those areas as well by creating industrial parks for settlers to be able to have close proximity to jobs. All of this means the confiscation, as you said, of greater and greater amounts of Palestinian land, and conversely, the herding of Palestinians into smaller and smaller parcels of land, even as that population continues to grow exponentially in the West Bank.
What is the strategy of settlements in general for the Israeli government right now? Not just in the West Bank, but also in is there a strategy in Gaza? Is there a strategy in southern Lebanon? And what incentives do they actually give people to live in the settlements altogether?
Well, sure. Let's keep in mind one strategy follows another. The main strategy of the Israeli government, by having over 10% of its Israeli Jewish population in occupied territories, in the settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is to be able to plant a flag of Israeli sovereignty that the world will have to recognize, and thereby, breach international laws against unilateral annexation by occupying powers. And the strategy for doing that is but this is the largest Israeli economic project in the history of the country. And what it's doing is giving extraordinary financial incentives for Israelis to move to the settlements by giving them much cheaper housing, cut rates with respect to mortgage, giving them all the, if you like, the military and security protection to make sure the settlements are relatively safe, make sure that the roads that the settlers drive on are going to be safe, that they are swift. transport going from the settlements in the heart of the West Bank into Tel Aviv or into Jerusalem. All of this is government financed. All of this is politically backed by every single Israeli government, regardless of whether it was a Labour government or a Likud government.
Okay, we know that there are sanctions against settlements, Israeli settlements altogether in the West Bank, and we've seen that these sanctions have not been able to stop these settlements. Now, it's a violation of international law, isn't it? And how can it be stopped within the frame of international law? And how can the sanctions actually impact what's going on and stop these settlements altogether?
Sure. Let's be clear about international law. Israeli settlements have been called by the UN Security Council in December 2016 as a flagrant violation under international law, and that includes the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits occupying powers from settling its civilian population or parts of its civilian population into occupied territory. But we are also moving to a higher level with respect to this. The Rome Statute of 1998, which created the International Criminal Court, is very clear that that settlements in occupied territory are a war crime, which is among the gravest of international breaches of law that we have. And you've mentioned sanctions. We actually have hardly even touched the surface in the international community with respect to sanctions. My own country, Canada, has a full free trade agreement with Israel, which allows goods and services coming from the Israeli settlements into Canada tariff-free as if they were products of Israel. I think any sanctions that are going to be meaningful with respect to cutting off the oxygen to these settlements has to be not only against the settlements themselves, but against Israel, simply because Israel and the settlements are tied by an umbilical cord. And you can sanction the settlements, that's going to mean something, but not very much. You have to sanction Israel itself for its defiance of international law.
So if we go back to the question to how to stop it in a frame of political and diplomatic efforts, is there another option? Is there a way? Is there a path?
Sure. Look, and the United Nations General Assembly and the International Court of Justice have pointed us on the path towards that. The International Court of Justice released a decision in July saying that all states have a responsibility under international law to put an end to the unlawful occupation. And that may mean stopping weapons trades, that may mean revisiting and ending free trade agreements or other forms of investment with respect to Israel. And those were endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in its decision in its resolution in September. And the General Assembly gave Israel 12 months to end the occupation. That means the diplomatic clock has now started to tick, and the alarm bells will ring next September. I doubt if Israel will take any steps to stop this occupation. So then it's going to be in the lap of the international community to be able to decide on a much broader range of sanctions against Israel itself. Okay,
let's take a quick break here, and we will see a report. This report, it shows how the Israeli government intensifies its right-wing policies. In the West Bank, it faces a growing wave of violence and settlement expansion, echoing the devastating toll of Gaza, with rising casualties and ongoing violations. The international community's failure to act raises the alarming questions that we're trying to answer right now. Is the West Bank the next Gaza?
After a year of aggression, the fate of Gaza awaits the West Bank. A year after escalation in Gaza, the situation in the West Bank is quickly evolving in a troubling direction, particularly with the rise of Israeli violence and settlement expansion under the current right-wing government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israeli violations in Gaza has been widely documented. with aerial bombardments targeting civilians, infrastructure, and essential services, leading to immense suffering. The Gaza Strip has experienced over thousands of casualties, including children, and widespread displacement. These actions, characterized by indiscriminate attacks, are a clear manifestation of Israel's continued pursuit of erasing Palestinian identity and territorial rights. Now attention shifts to the West Bank. Israel has ramped up settlements construction at an unprecedented rate, further fragmenting Palestinian land and impeding the establishment of a viable Palestinian state. Israeli forces continue to carry out raids, arrest Palestinian civilians, and demolish homes, all with the goal of solidifying control over key areas, undermining Palestinian political and territorial aspirations. This escalation is a continuation of a long-term strategy to weaken Palestinian society and erase its historical and cultural ties to the land. The international community's response has been inadequate, despite global condemnation of Israel's action, especially during the military offensives in Gaza. Tangible efforts to curb these violations have been absent. The US, EU, and UN have expressed concern but have failed to take effective steps towards enforcement or sanctions against Israel. In the coming months, we may witness the West Bank facing similar fates to Gaza, unless diplomatic intervention is prioritized. The continued expansion of settlements and violation of Palestinian rights will only fuel further tensions, with dire consequences for regional stability.
We continue with Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. He's joining us from Ontario. Again, thank you for joining us, Michael. Now, we were trying to answer the question, as I said in the lead of this report, is the West Bank Gaza's next fate, or is it going to be the next Gaza? But before we answer this question, we should really talk about the fate of Gaza and the strategy which the Israeli government is taking right now towards Gaza. What do you think of it, and how is it going to unfold in the coming days or perhaps the coming weeks?
Interesting. We often see commentaries who are knowledgeable about the Middle East, and particularly about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, saying that they think that the Israelis have no strategy for the day after with respect to Gaza in particular and Palestine more specifically. I think they do have a strategy, and I think it's probably fairly clear in the articulation by a number of Israeli cabinet ministers, in that there should be if you like, a permanent subjugation of the Palestinians in the West Bank, that there would be no voting rights for Palestinians in the areas that are going to be formally annexed by Israel, which would the ambition is to include all of the West Bank, and that Gaza would either be entirely or almost entirely emptied of its 2.3 million Palestinians, or that the Palestinians who live there would be either given to Egypt or would remain, if you like, in a encased and imprisoned open air compound where they would continue to live at the mercy, if you like, of international aid coming through. These are the designs of the Israeli government. The West in particular may talk about a two-state solution, but I've seen no strategy among countries in the global north, Europe and North America in particular, which tells me they have any idea of how to reach a two-state solution with a Palestinian state when you have 740,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And this,
do you think it's only about the settlements in the West Bank? When we talk about the obstacles to any kind of talks about a two-state solution, is there a political drive also? Is there a political problem? Do you see any possibility when we have Netanyahu's government in charge, and I don't know what kind of rule they are thinking of for Gaza in the coming future, and what kind of situation can actually a two-state solution be talked about in discussions and negotiations?
None that I see right now. The West, the global North, as I said, talks repeatedly about a two-state solution. That is obviously the official consensus point of the international community and the United Nations with respect to this. But show me where any of them have been able to lay out a determined, detailed political strategy of how to achieve that. If Israel suffered a political nervous breakdown by removing 8,000 settlers from Gaza in 2005, tell me how the West is going to force Israel to remove 740,000 or even 150,000 settlers from East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And when you look at the Israeli political spectrum, you look at the positions of the opposition leaders to Netanyahu, they don't disagree fundamentally with this point of view that East Jerusalem is Israeli, that the West Bank will be largely Israeli in any kind of peace talks, and the Palestinians will not get Israeli citizenship, or they would have simply a little Bantustan of their own that can issue its own stamps and can have its flag at the United Nations, but it doesn't meet any modern definition of a state. West, I think, is deluding itself in thinking that repeatedly talking about a two-state solution will wind up making it so. This occupation, this annexation will not die of old age.
Okay, now let's take another quick break, and we will watch this report about the escalating Israeli violations in the West Bank that continue to cause immense suffering for Palestinian civilians. From increased military raids and land sieges to the erosion of Palestinian identity, the region faces a deepening humanitarian crisis. Let's take a look at that. Now again, we welcome Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories from Ontario. And Michael, I'd like to thank you for being with us, but last question, if I may. Now, what is, in your opinion, the most important priority right now for the international community addressing what's happening in the region, from human rights violations and escalation that is also probable in the coming days and the coming weeks?
I would say actually two. One, obviously, is a ceasefire, an immediate total ceasefire that ends all military campaigns in Gaza, in Lebanon, and the threat of one in Iran. But with that, that ceasefire would mean very little unless there is also international accountability. Accountability imposed upon those who are alleged credibly to have committed crimes against humanity or even genocide with respect to this. The reason why we continue to have a deepening occupation by Israel, the reason why we have the continuation of these wars, and this is obviously the most destructive of wars we've had in the region in well over 70 years, is because Israel does not face accountability. There are numerous resolutions enacted by the Security Council and the General Assembly critical of Israeli actions, and yet none of them have been enforced against Israel. International law only works when you have international resolve, political will to put them into action. And as long as Israel can think it can deepen the occupation without consequences and conduct such a massive catastrophic war in Gaza or this new war in Lebanon without consequences, we're only going to see the continuation of this.
Well, that was Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories from Ontario. Thank you very much for your insights and for joining us on Q News. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes on Q News. This was Karim Hatton. Bye-bye for now.